He was the guy that married the Broadway show tune tradition with a more downtown sensibility.
Billy Joel is just a great American songwriter.
He's a man who's struggled. He's a man who's struggled with himself, with others, with the courts, with his problems, and musically at least, he's come through everything.
He's the piano man.
Billy Joel was raised in the New York suburb of Hicksville in the 1950s. Despite the optimism that the new decade brought, the shadow of the Second World War still hung over the Jewish family.
Billy Joel's father, Howard, was a German Jew who'd escaped from the Nazis. And he moved to the east coast of America, and he had a little bit of money behind him, and he brought up Billy and his sister in reasonably affluent circumstances.
His father was one of the people that joined the American army to go and liberate the concentration camps at the end of the war, and was so traumatized by it that he was a very, very distant father.
Then his parents divorced, and Howard moved back to Europe, to Vienna, in fact. Billy's mother, Rosalind, was very, very keen that her son should be a piano player, as his absent father had been.
As well as his piano lessons, Billy's interest in music was sparked by the arrival of the Beatles. In 1964, the band famously played on The Ed Sullivan Show. The episode was watched by 73 million people, including a teenage Billy.
If you're a kid of his age and you're even slightly into music and you saw the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show, you would have gone, I'm going to have some of that.
I think he famously said something about, I'm not going to Columbia University, I'm going to Columbia Records, and he did.
Billy joined a succession of cover bands, which initially did well off the back of the success of the British musical invasion.
He was in a band called The Echoes, who were a Brit invasion covers band, so they'd cover all the 60s British bands that were coming over to America, like the Animals and the Stones.
He did some work for Shadow Morton as well, the American producer. There's a rumour that he played on Leader of the Pack as well.
The early bands that he was in were kind of commercial disasters, and he had a fight with another band member over, I think, having an affair with his wife or something. It was a bit of a difficult beginning.
Despite the lack of commercial success from these ventures, Billy's songwriting talent was spotted by Family Productions, who gave him his first solo album deal. His debut record, Cold Spring Harbor, was released in 1971.
Turned on you. Cold Spring Harbor, which was named after an East Coast hamlet that Billy Joel was very fond of, was a disaster from start to finish. It was meant to be his big introduction to the music business.
He signed with a guy called Artie Ripp, who was running a company called Family Productions. Bit of a cowboy, to say the least, and he produced the album. Somehow it ended up speeding up the vocals slightly and distorting them, so it sounded really weird and ridiculous. But unfortunately, Artie Ripp had made him sign a contract for 10 albums.
Artie Ripp's contract was binding, so under the moniker of Bill Martin, Billy moved to LA and returned to the piano bar circuit. However, it was here that he would write the song that would change his fortune. Columbia introduced Billy to producer Phil Ramone before recording his next album. Phil was a much-touted producer who had worked with Aretha Franklin and Bob Dylan, and had just won a Grammy for his work with Paul Simon. The label hoped he would give Billy the mainstream hit that was eluding him.
Billy Joel is just one of those people who has a natural commercial sensibility, like his songwriting is very naturally radio-friendly and poppy. And I think he was kind of suppressing that a little bit because of his roots, because you know, because he'd grown up with being into bands and that kind of like teenage rebel thing.
But I think, encouraged by Phil Ramone, he'd stopped singing about losers so much. These characters who were kind of, not low lives, that's putting it too much, but people who were unlucky in love and unlucky in life, had populated his earlier albums. Suddenly they didn't.
Phil Ramone was a commercial force. You know, he knew how to shape these songs and give that kind of polish and sheen.
The partnership between Phil Ramone and Billy Joel produced The Stranger. The album was critically acclaimed, along with being his best-selling to date. The single, Just the Way You Are, became his first top 10 hit, but unfortunately it would become associated with his failing marriage to wife Elizabeth Weber.
Don't imagine you're too familiar, and I don't see you anymore. I could not leave you in times of trouble. We never would have come this far. I took the good times, I'll take the bad times. I take you just the way you are.
Just the Way You Are ended up being a bit of an awkward track for Billy Joel because he obviously wrote it about his wife at the time, Elizabeth Weber, and then they got divorced. I think he sort of refused to play it live for a couple of years after as a result of, you know, following the divorce.
Change the color of your hair. You always have my unspoken passion, although I might not seem to care.
He didn't actually like the song, which I find very surprising. He had to be convinced that it was a good song. I think it was Phil Ramone who said, listen, this is a great song, you need to put this out there. He didn't want it to be a single, which is strange because it does sound like a single to me. I mean, it's just one of those ballads that you hear and you think, God, you know you're going to hear this on the radio in 20 years' time.
I think 52nd Street's interesting as an album because it's a bit more sophisticated and kind of jazzy than The Stranger.
You sound funny, but it's still rock and roll to me.
With the song It's Still Rock and Roll to Me, he kind of makes reference to new wave and to punk. And the theory obviously being that it's just rock and roll like I was into when I was a kid dressed up in different clothing, which there is an element of truth in. But punk, it was about more than just the music. It was about an attitude. It was about a divide between the old guards and the new breeds.
Rock and roll to me. Oh, it doesn't matter what they say in the papers. It's always been the same old scene. There's a new band in town, but you can't get the sound from the story in a magazine.
It was billed as a kind of new wave album. It's not a new wave album at all. Or it's only rock and roll to me, that song. You know, I mean, it's a good fun song. It's not new wave. It's not like some underground art rock. You know, it's a, you know, it could be on a Broadway show.
He's wearing a leather jacket, very fetching on the front cover. But musically, it just doesn't ring true for me. I mean, I think Billy Joel's at his best when he's doing what is close to him and what he knows best, which is ballads, it's soft rock.
Billy Joel sold millions of records, plays out these huge venues, and yet he's still worried about what a minor critic says against him. So hence, when he was touring around the period of It's Still Rock and Roll to Me, then he would tear up reviews on stage. And this might have appealed to the front rows, but frankly, it's a pretty petulant thing.
Billy's 1982 release, The Nylon Curtain, showed a different side to his talent. He took inspiration from the music of John Lennon and the social changes under the Reagan government. The single Allentown spoke of the decline of the American steel industry.
Living here in Allentown, and they're closing all the factories down.
I think The Nylon Curtain's an interesting record because he starts kind of focusing less on personal troubles and looks more exploring the American dream, exploring political themes, and I find it really interesting when artists do that, start kind of looking out into the world rather than focusing on their own issues.
I can see why it's his favourite album of all the albums that he's done. It's quite exotic and adventurous, and it has a lot more to it.
So you have you have this lengthy standout track, Goodnight Saigon, which is arguably more sensitive, more acutely written than almost any song about the Vietnam struggles. It shows that he could actually be a very weighty songwriter.
And we held on to each other like brother to brother. We promised our mothers we'd write.
In 1983, Billy moved away from the serious themes of Nylon Curtain and produced the more upbeat and Innocent Man. The album was an homage to his early influences.
You know I don't like watching anybody make the same mistakes I made. She's a real nice girl and she's always there for you. But a nice girl wouldn't tell you what you should do.
Doo-wop was the sound of New York in the 50s. You know, Lou Reed always talks about a great love of doo-wop. So here's a Bronx boy, you know, growing up in the 50s and the early 60s. He would have heard this stuff all the time. And so I think it wasn't just nostalgia. He was really reflecting his own background with that.
Nothing she ought to know. Tell her about it. Tell her everything you feel. Give her every reason to accept that you're for real.
As is always the case with those kind of hits, the public suddenly has this appetite for something they didn't know what they wanted, which happened to be polished, souped-up 80s style Motown, which, whether by coincidence or by design, An Innocent Man had in abundance.
Uptown girl, she's been living in her white bread world as long as anyone with hot blood can. And now she's looking for a downtown man. That's what I am.
Town Girl, which was the most loving tribute to Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, who were, of course, the ultimate East Coast band. You couldn't have grown up in the 60s and been a New Yorker without being in absolute thrall to Frankie Valli.
Uptown Girl's a great song, you know, it's so catchy. It's one of those, again, like a guilty pleasure, one you can't help singing along to when it comes on the radio. It's just really fun.
That kind of Grease video where they're, you know, working in the garage and Christy Brinkley comes in and, you know, struts around looking hot.
Christy Brinkley became Billy Joel's second wife when they married in 1985. 4 years later, Billy released Stormfront, and the album's lead single, We Didn't Start the Fire, listed historic events from his birth up until the Cold War, which was dominating the era.
Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China, Johnny Ray, South Pacific, Walter Winchell, Joe DiMaggio.
It deals with huge, earth-shaking world events in like one word. And if you look at all the references that are in that song, I mean, it would take you pages and pages just to list them, let alone make any comment on them. But then it does have a very catchy chorus.
I think he did a tour of the USSR just before he wrote this song. So that kind of got his mind going. I mean, it's very, very clever.
It wasn't really a political album. It still had Billy Joel's themes of love and loss and despair in there. There was just hints of a newfound politicisation.
The girl was born in the spring of 44.
He met Sean Lennon, and Sean Lennon was 21 at the time, and he said, "Oh, it's a terrible time to be 21. You know, it's awful." And he said it must have been so much better in the 50s. And he said, "What are you talking about? Haven't you heard of the Korean War, or you know, the Suez Crisis?" And Sean Lennon said, "Yes, well, yeah, but now we've got the weight of all these things, and nothing's changed." So I think it was a reflection on that, and a reflection that at the time the Cold War was still raging. We didn't, you know, no one knew which way it's going to turn. There've been various crises over the years where it seems, you know, Armageddon was around the corner.
Upon the release of Stormfront, Billy entered into a succession of battles with his management and his former lawyer. It was a tough time for him as he was also on the brink of divorce from his wife.
Christie had actually painted the sleeve of what would be his last pop album, River of Dreams.
It's a darker, more kind of reflective side we see of him, and it was his last pop record, and I think maybe it's been difficult for him to follow it.
Billy's musical output seemed to stop, but then in 2003 he returned with something unexpected, a piano concerto album he had composed called Fantasies and Delusions.
He's obviously a virtuoso piano player, very, very good at that. So some of the compositions which are just him and piano are actually not bad at all.
He's a brilliant pianist. There's no reason why he shouldn't make a classical album. He's good enough. It might have been homage to his father. You know, his father was a classical pianist and he had this rather fractured relationship with him, so it might well have been that.
There's no denying that the guy has an ability to write great, great songs.
I took the good times, I'll take the bad times.